This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books. This is chapter 5, entitled Forces Pushing Towards the Creation of a Global State, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis from my second book, entitled Multis and Monos: What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. Chapter 5. Forces Pushing Towards the Creation of a Global State. Subtopic headings: A. Introduction. B. Internet. C. Travel. D. Economic growth. E. Global economy. F. Transport systems. G. World trade and banking. H. Economic and political unions. I. United Nations. J. World court and international law. K. Satellite television. L. The global language. M. The Glow Media Project. N. Global cultural homogenization. O. Multi-ideology. Monos are boring. P. Global mentality. A. Introduction. This chapter is devoted to discussing those technological, economic, political, and social forces that make the creation of a global state more probable, perhaps even inevitable, this century. These forces can be interpreted as being preconditions for the creation of a global state, as the title of this chapter implies. Each of these forces is briefly introduced here to give an overview, and then treated in more detail later in the chapter. I'll begin with the rise of the Internet, which in 30 years from the time of writing, that's 2007, will be 1 billion times faster, thus allowing a level of communication between the world's citizens that will make the idea of global cultural homogenization realistic. I believe that this Internet argument is the most powerful globalizing force in this list. As people get richer due to the economic growth of their country's economies, a higher proportion of the nation's citizens travel to other countries as tourists. Touristing broadens the mind and makes one question the customs of one's own monoculture. Tourists then return to their home country with ideas to change the inferiorities of the country they grew up in. Touristing has a culturally homogenizing effect on the planet. Without a reasonably high standard of living, poor countries cannot afford to have their populations have access to computers, to have access to the internet, or to take jet trips to foreign countries, etc. A certain minimum living standard is a prerequisite for a country or culture to begin to globalize. We live increasingly in a global economy where business is no longer international but global. For example, recently I bought a woolen head warmer made in the Turkish style in Berlin. When I looked at the label, it said "Made in China." As multinational companies expand their markets and advertise their products and services, the economy becomes more and more homogenized. You can buy the same McDonald's hamburger with the same taste in 100 countries. Most air travelers are in fact business travelers. They are the harbingers of the community of multis. When the jumbo jets came into service in the early 1970s, they created a tourist revolution, because hundreds of people at a time could be seated in a single airplane that could fly across the world in half a day. The economies of scale and inter-airline competition forced down prices, so that millions of people in the rich countries started to travel to other countries. Soon Europe's super jumbo will come into service, carrying up to 800 people at a time. Other transport systems, such as Europe's high-speed trains, maglev, that's magnetic levitation, trains, etc., will only make travel faster and cheaper. Greater travel will create more people with cosmopolitan, that is, multi-minds. International organizations concerned with international trade, banking, finance, etc., have a powerful effect on countries wishing to join the club of nations already operating in the world economy. For example, if a third world nation wants to borrow money from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, it has to meet certain conditions which force it to clean up its act, that is, modernize its financial and economic institutions, which in turn create a greater degree of economic and later cultural homogenization. Similarly with the WTO, World Trade Organization. that even communist regimes such as China and Vietnam have joined recently. These countries are forced to obey WTO rules if they are to become members. This too leads to economic and cultural homogeneity. Economic and political unions, such as the European Union, EU, are moving beyond the nation-state to the formation of regional blocs. There are a growing number of such economic political blocs in the world now. At the time of writing, the EU consisted of 27 countries, with a waiting list of other countries wanting to join. Future historians will probably interpret the creation of these unions as the essential political stepping stone towards the creation of Globa, the global state. The United Nations, UN, was formed just after World War II as an institution to foster good behaviour of individual nations by group pressure from the majority of other nations. As an institution, it has largely failed because we still live in a historical era of belligerent nation-states. Our political units are nations, some of them very powerful, which can easily ignore the opinions expressed by the majority of other nations in the UN, for example, the US and its invasion of Iraq. The UN does, however, have the role of being the planet's conscience. Increasingly, if a group of nations feels that a particular nation is out of line, that is, needs to be punished for its crimes, then it can appeal to the UN to pass UN resolutions that can impose sanctions on or even declare war against an aberrant nation. World opinion, as expressed via the UN, is now a major moral force in the world. The US was scorned by many nations when it single-handedly, misguidedly invaded Iraq and caused more harm than good. The UN may serve as a stepping stone towards the creation of a global state, if enough powerful nations agree to do this and transform the UN into Globa. There's now a world court based in The Hague in Holland, whose job is to adjudicate international global law. For example, against crimes against humanity committed by smaller nations who commit genocide against other peoples. This court is a stepping stone towards a more powerful body needed in the future, so that all nations can be subject to it. The US, the only superpower at the present time, rejects joining it because it does not want to have its own power diminished. A world court is an essential ingredient for a global state. It already exists, but in an embryonic form. When I was living in Brussels, I was able to rotate my satellite television receiver dish to dozens of satellites to receive several hundred TV programs from that part of the world. Modern technology will make it easier for stationary orbit TV satellites to send signals between themselves so that an uplink signal can be cross-linked to other satellites and then downlinked to Earth, so that an uplink signal sent from anywhere on Earth can be transmitted to the whole surface of the planet. When the citizens of the Earth can get the TV and media from the whole planet, their minds will be globalized, not nationalized, as is the case today. At the time of writing, English is the most studied and the most spoken second language in the world, to such an extent that it's fair to label it the world language. I believe there will only be one world language, that is, once there is one, it will remain the only one, because the world's population will not bother learning another one. It takes too much time and energy to learn a foreign language, so the world will simply not bother learning a second one. If the world's populations all speak and understand the world language, then we have a powerful force for globalization. Ideas can then spread easily over the planet at the speed of light. International distrust will decrease because people will understand each other better. A global language is a critical prerequisite for the creation of Globa. Once you have a global language and a hyper-fast internet, it will be possible to create what I call the Glo Media Project, that is, the Global Media Project, which would give to virtually every person on Earth the total media of all the Earth. This project would foster strongly the use of a global language, since a snowball effect would be created in which most programs sent all over the Earth would be in English. The Glo Media Project would reprogram people's minds. Most people simply absorb opinions. Only a tiny minority of people are the opinion makers. Hence, if the source of people's opinions is global rather than national, their personal opinions will be global. They will think global and have global attitudes and be more favourable to the creation of a global state. When Bolivar, the South American revolutionary, dreamed of creating a United States of South America, he died a disillusioned man. He's famous for his quote that attempting to unite the various states of South America was as futile as ploughing the sea. If the Spaniards had colonized South America a century later, in the time of the railroad, then perhaps Bolivar would have seen his dream come true. It's only now that South American countries are uniting economically and politically with their Mercosur, MERCOSUR, and similar organizations. One of the basic premises of this whole book is that there will be no global state so long as there are strong cultural differences and values between peoples of the earth. A process of global cultural homogenization will be a powerful prerequisite to form a global state. Once everyone thinks more or less the same, by being exposed to the best ideas from the whole planet, they will be much less likely to disagree, and hence be more likely to abandon nationalist ways and think globally, with global goals and global institutions, including the most important of them all, the creation of a global state. To expedite the process of global cultural homogenization, it will be useful to create an ideology in favor of globism, that is, an ideology that consciously, energetically and intellectually pushes the idea that humanity would be happier and better off living in a global state. One very effective way to do this will be to use the carrot and stick approach, that is, to attract people to globism and to repel people from nationalism. For example, using the terms multi and mono has connotations that multis are sophisticated, cosmopolitan, superior people, and that monos are ignorant, provincial, inferior people. As the ideology of globism, the logical limit of multiism, spreads and becomes fashionable and popular, less progressive people, the more mono people, will feel the social pressure against them from the multis. For example, the multi slogan, "Monos are boring," and be more motivated to become multis themselves, thus hastening the globalization process and leading to a quicker creation of the global state. Third world countries are populated by people with third world minds. These countries are held back by the backward mentalities of the people who live in them. Similarly, a global state will be populated by people who think and act globally because they have grown up being surrounded by global influences, a global language, a global media, a global culture, global beliefs, etc. One of the primary aims of the globists needs to be to teach people to think globally, to want to live globally, to want to create a global state, and to push for it politically, that is, to be ideologically committed to this goal. Globism is a state of mind, a mentality in favor of living in a much better world, one without war, without the waste of the defense industries, the elimination of global poverty, and a fairer distribution of the world's resources. See Chapter 10 for more on the positive consequences of living in a global state. B. Internet. Anyone reading this book has probably had experience with the Internet, that is, the global intercomputer communications network that allows people to access knowledge from each other's websites, that is, a set of files belonging to an individual user or group of people that are stored on millions of servers, that is, computers specifically used for Internet access and storage around the world. Speaking personally, I use the Internet several hours a day for emails, accessing news, reading scientific papers, etc. The Internet has had as much impact on me and a billion others as have books. I have about 10,000 books in my private library, and they give me enormous pleasure, but so too does the Internet, because with it I can access the ideas and writings, lectures, videos, music, etc. from the whole planet. It is an incredible resource and has changed my life. Ad-libbing, I got rid of my eventually 12,500 paper books. I donated them to the city library. Virtually everything I have now is in electronic form. I have about 50,000 electronic books and papers, and I have e-ink electronic readers, so I've gone totally electronic. So paper to me now seems quaint and fossilized. All countries, that's in 2017, back to the book. All countries now recognize the importance of the Internet as a means to modernize themselves. Any country too poor or too backward to have access to the Internet remains backward and ignorant. I remember on my first visit to China in 1995, talking together with other Western researchers and professors to a Chinese government scientific advisor. We really buttonholed him, saying, quote, The single most important tool to modernize your country is the internet. At the time, I felt the level of scientific knowledge in China was about a decade behind the West. A few years later, the Chinese computer science labs I was visiting every year had given every student a desktop computer in their computer labs and easy access to the world internet. As a result, they had caught up to the West and were discussing the latest world ideas. The internet has already played a major historical role in the development of the world, but its potential is hugely greater. I will now give a mildly mathematical analysis to support what I've just said. In the world of electronics, the number of transistors technology has been putting on a chip has been doubling roughly every 18 months. This trend goes under the name of Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, co-founder of the microprocessor company Intel, made this observation in 1965, and it has remained valid for over 40 years. 50 years now. That is a lot of doublings. The consequence is that it's possible to put hundreds of millions of transistors on today's chips. Well, now it's tens of billions. Back to the book. A similar phenomenon is also occurring with the number of bits, that's zeros or ones, of information that can be sent down a wire or optical fiber cable. But this time the doubling speed is faster, that is every 12 months, not 18 months. There's no generally recognized label for this trend, so I use the term Brad law, that is the bit rate annual doubling law. If one does the math, then assuming this trend will continue for another 30 years, and there are no physics principles forbidding such a growth, so probably it will happen, then that is 30 doublings, which is about 1 billion. That is 1,000 million. So the internet of the year 2037, so I wrote this in 2007, should be 1 billion times faster than what we have at the time of writing. Let us assume that it's possible to have such a hyper-fast internet within 30 years, so now within 20 years. What could we do with such speeds, and what impact would such an internet have on our society? I think the answers to this question are dramatic. For example, I think it would enable the internet to deliver 3D, three-dimensional images. Why do I think this? Here is the analysis I mentioned above. Take a conventional computer screen with, let us say, 1,000 times 700 pixels, that is picture elements, that is colored dots on the screen. An image consists of many such dots very close together. That's 700,000 pixels per image. It's possible now to show movies on a laptop at about 30 frames images per second. That is 30 by 1,000 by 700 pixels per second equals roughly 20 million pixels per second. Assume each pixel is coded by 16 bits, zeros or ones, so that is roughly 300 million bits per second. Today's broadband, that is high-speed, internet, is close to coping with such speeds and delivers good quality 2D movie compressed images on the screen of a PC or laptop. But imagine the internet were 1 billion times faster, then we could transmit. Could we then transmit 3D images? Let's do the math. We assume the usual 30 frames per second, but now our pixels are 3D. That is, we need to create colored dots in a 3D medium. That is the vid, V-I-D, vid for video. How many bits per second internet speed will we need for a 3D space of, say, 1,000 by 700 by 1,000 pixels? Well, 1,000 times more, but we have 1 billion times more speed. So let us expand the size of our 3D space to, say, 100,000 by 70,000 by 100,000. Here we have increased the length, breadth and depth by a factor of 100 each. That is 1 million times more. If you increase the size of a laptop computer screen by 100, you get an image the size of a room. Now the eye cannot see out of the back of its head, so this room-sized space would be enough to create a 3D image of a room-sized object at good resolution. Now, not all of these 3D pixels would need to emit light at the same moment. Most 3D pixels convey little information, e.g. pixels inside a big patch of red. So we could cut down on the number of 3D pixels needed and hence increase the resolution of the image, that is, how closely packed the pixels are. The bottom line of the above analysis is that it will be technically possible to generate 3D images that are almost as real as the real world, that is, with equal resolution and with 3D stereo visual effects. Hence the technology will be able to create 3D images as good as the real world. We will not be able to detect the difference. For fans of the US science fiction TV series Star Trek, the new generation, these images would be equivalent to the holodeck. Now, we can ask more political, social questions. What effect would such 3D images have upon humanity? Try to imagine such a technology. Images would be as real as the real world, so talking to someone who was on the other side of the earth would appear as real to you as if that person was in the same room as you. Imagine the emotional impact of such an image. You'd be able to pick up all the emotional nuances of the other person. The experience would be as emotionally real as if there were two real people in the same room. Assume further that the price of such a contact is extremely cheap as or cheaper than a local phone call is today, so that it would be easy to make such calls. Then calling people would be much more common and pleasurable because the experience would be so much more real than today's video phone call with a small 2D image or voice only. As a result, many more people would be calling across the planet, thus increasing the global cultural homogenization process. Increasing bit rates will allow the internet to play a critically important role in the education of the world's citizens. Starting at the same time of writing, it's possible to record university lectures of famous professors and then put the lectures on the internet for the world to see. Top universities now have policies of recording all their lectures and making them available to the planet on the internet. I know from my own experience how much I enjoy listening and watching top lecturers and researchers explaining their work, or listening to the opinions of people in political science, philosophy, history, etc. It's very enlightening and enjoyable because of the quality of the people giving the lectures. The whole planet can benefit from this. These lectures will be available to everyone and will help push the creation of the world language, that is, English. In parallel with the development of the internet with ever greater speeds will be the development of more intelligent search engines. For example, that is, the computer programs that search the databases linked to the internet to find the information that users want. For example, wouldn't it be nice if one could simply talk to your computer with such questions as, what year was Cleopatra born? How many people did Stalin kill in his purges, etc.? Your computer would send messages to the internet, which then goes hunting for the answers and sends them back to your computer. You can then receive the answers either in text or in speech. As the internet gets faster and more information is available, it will be possible to educate yourself in a topic that interests you. You will have a wide range of possibilities, some of them truly excellent. This is already possible today. I routinely teach myself new advanced topics that I give lectures on to my graduate classes. The intellectuals of the world will be able to get access to the best tutorials on the planet, and hence will be well informed about places and events that have occurred all over the world, thus further reducing monocultured ignorance of other cultures, their histories and opinions. Ad-libbing 2017, we're pretty well there. I mean, you can Google in, it's now a verb, you can type in questions to Google of quite considerable complexity and get reasonably good answers back. So the level of artificial intelligence in Google is quite impressive. I think I read some years back they had about 200 different PhDs in artificial intelligence in Google. Maybe that number's conservative now. Although it's a great pity that YouTube, which Google bought, is now censoring. So that's the kiss of death for them. If they don't stop censoring, they'll die, because alternative platforms will spring up that make it impossible to censor, and they will thrive and Google will die. Stupid fucks. The internet will be the great educator. It will kill off provincial mindedness, or as I call it throughout this book, the tyranny of monocultured media. To the leaderships of the few remaining dictatorships left in the world, the idea of having their populations exposed to the opinions of other cultures is profoundly threatening, so they make it illegal to receive, for example, the TV programs of other countries. Ad-libbing as in China. Chinese people are utterly brainwashed by a CCP, Chinese Communist Party, monopolized media. So in Chinese living rooms, Chinese can get only Chinese CCP-dominated, monopolized media and have their brains utterly brainwashed. For example, imagine if the Japanese public could receive TV programs from China dubbed into Japanese of documentaries about what Japanese soldiers did in World War II. Or imagine the effect on the Chinese if they could see Western documentaries about Mao Zedong and the 70 million people he killed. Mao was the greatest tyrant in history, killing more people than Hitler or Stalin, who were the other two great arch-monsters of the 20th century. I remember when I was living in Brussels, being fluent in French and German, listening to commentators from both countries discussing a disagreement between the French and German governments. I would listen to the French view and then the German view on the same issue. From the French perspective in history, the French view made sense. From the German perspective in history, the German view made sense. Unfortunately, the two views differed and clashed. But because I was exposed to both views, my own view was tempered by hearing both sides. I wouldn't be at all surprised that one of the major reasons why the European countries are unifying so readily now, I remember I wrote this in 2007, the Brits have pulled out of the European Union, called Brexit. So it looks as though the European Union is going to break up. The northern European countries, which are much more economically successful, will probably form a new kind of union, and they will ditch the southern European states, which are much less efficient, less disciplined. Unifying so readily now is due to the fact that these countries get each other's television channels in their cables or from satellite. When I was living in Japan, or the US, or China, this was much less the case, or not at all. These countries had largely monocultured media, and their populations were thus very monocultured. They were largely ignorant of the views of other cultures, for the simple reason that they were not exposed to them. Hence, consciously or unconsciously, these monos were brainwashed by the monocultured journalists who put their opinion into the heads of the monocultured citizens. In a sense, it was a case of the blind leading the blind. The mono-journalists were reinforcing the stereotype views of others' cultures in the minds of their publics. Since the monocultured peoples of monocultured countries have no experience of living in other countries or are not exposed to the media of other countries, they are then stuck in their monocultured limitations. The internet will play a major role in killing off this ignorance. Now, of course, initially a lot of the material on the internet will be in many languages and hence not be accessible to people not knowing those languages. For example, very soon there will be more pages on the internet in Chinese than in English. I cannot read Chinese because of the difficulty of having to learn a character-based writing system rather than the hugely simpler and far more intelligent phonetically based alphabet-based writing system as used in most countries around the world. Hence, this huge Chinese internet resource is largely closed to the rest of the world. A similar story will hold for most languages. But governments will realize this. So if they want their own countries and cultures to be influential in a globalizing world, then they will be motivated to create programs and internet material in the world language that billions of people can understand. As more governments do this, the higher the proportion of internet material will be in English, and hence the stronger the motivation of people around the world to learn the world language. If they remain ignorant of English, they will be excluded from world culture, and the multis surrounding them will look down on them as mono-ignorami, narrow-minded, and fools. Hence more and more monos will want to become multis, and the most effective way to become a multi is to learn English and educate yourself into global culture with the internet. With 3D, real-life quality images from an advanced hyper-speed internet, the world will be able to make communication distance-independent. In terms of the quality and price of the images that the internet will provide, it will not matter if the person one is communicating with is next door or on the other side of the earth. C. Travel. When I was a young man in my early 20s, I travelled around Europe using the youth hostels because they were cheap and I didn't have much money at the time. One thing I noticed was the quality of the people staying at the youth hostels. They were nearly all graduates of universities, and virtually all of them from the rich countries. In those days, the early 1970s, there were virtually no Japanese or Chinese tourists in Europe. In those days, the Japanese were still poor, and the Chinese were suffering through Mao's Cultural Revolution. My impression was that only the more intelligent, more curious and adventurous people travelled internationally. Years later, when living in the US, I noticed that everybody got on airplanes to travel across the country. The passengers were virtually classless, that is, of all classes, university graduates, ordinary workers, and even the relatively poorer working class. What had changed? What had made travel so much more universal and popular? ? There are several answers, several factors. One is price. The price of an airline ticket had become much cheaper once the US government deregulated the airlines, that is, let them compete with each other in an open market, instead of having the government regulate, plan the industry. Once airlines started competing with each other, prices came down considerably, so of course the number of passengers went up, including the proportion of relatively poorer people. Similarly,